My name is Josephine Calloway, though everyone in Baton Rouge who's eaten at my grandmother's restaurant just calls me Joe. 6 weeks ago, I stood in the back office of Calloway's Kitchen on Perkins Road at 4:47 in the afternoon and listened to my Uncle Desmond tell a real estate agent named Trent Boudreau in front of my own younger cousin that I was just kitchen staff, nothing more, no ownership stake, no say in this. The papers were already spread across my grandmother's old desk, a purchase agreement for $410,000, a buyer's inspection report, a closing date circled in red for August the 3rd. Desmond had his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a pen already uncapped in his hand. I didn't argue. I just reached into my bag, pulled out a manila folder I'd been carrying around for 11 days, and set it flat on top of the purchase agreement. "Before anyone signs anything," I said, "you're going to want to read this first." Desmond looked at the folder like it was an insect that had landed on his paperwork. "What is this, Joe?" I didn't answer him yet, but to understand why I wasn't shaking when I said that, you have to go back 4 years, to a Tuesday morning in March when my grandmother, Odette Calloway, sat me down at that same desk and told me something I didn't fully understand the weight of until the day I watched Trent Boudreau's pen freeze over that purchase agreement. Before I get into that, if this story's got you hooked already, take a second to like this video and subscribe to The Quiet Reckoning, but only if you're genuinely enjoying it so far. Drop the name of your favorite family recipe in the comments below, the one that feels like it belongs to somebody. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to where this actually started, because none of what happened in that office makes sense without it. Calloway's Kitchen has been open on Perkins Road since 1987. My grandmother Odette started it with a $6,000 loan from her sister and a menu built entirely around her own mother's Creole recipes. A shrimp and okra gumbo that regulars still drive across the parish for. A red beans and rice she made every single Monday without exception for 37 years, and a bread pudding with a bourbon sauce that a local food writer once called the best $6 you'll spend in East Baton Rouge Parish. I grew up in that kitchen. My mother, Odette's oldest daughter, worked the front of house until she passed when I was 17, and after that, Odette more or less raised me in the back kitchen instead of a regular house, teaching me her recipes one at a time, the way some grandmothers teach quilting. By the time I was 26, I was the one actually running the kitchen day to day. Odette was 74 by then. Her knees weren't what they used to be, and she trusted me with the stove the way she'd never quite trusted my Uncle Desmond, her only son, who'd worked the business side of the restaurant for years, but had never once, in his own words, been much of a cook. Desmond handled invoices, vendor contracts, the lease renewal every few years. I handled the food. It felt for a long time like a fair division of labor between us, even if nobody ever called it that directly. The tension started, quietly, about 4 years ago. The same spring Odette sat me down at that desk. She'd started noticing something at the restaurant's monthly tastings, a private thing she did with a small circle of longtime regulars, testing seasonal specials before they went on the menu. And she'd realized that every dish getting the best reactions in the last 2 years had one thing in common. It wasn't one of her original 30-year-old recipes anymore. It was something I'd developed myself, building on her techniques but adding my own instincts. A smoked duck and andouille gumbo that had become the restaurant's single best-selling entree within 8 months of me introducing it. A praline bread pudding variation that outsold her original 3-to-1 on weekends. "You've built something real here, Joe," she told me that Tuesday morning, sliding a business card across the desk toward me. It read, "Broussard and Fine, Intellectual Property Attorneys, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I want you to protect it, not from me, from whatever happens after I'm gone." I asked her what she meant, and she was plain about it in a way I've come to appreciate more with every year that's passed since. She said, "Desmond's a good son, but he's never once cooked a meal in that kitchen he'd be proud to serve a stranger, and I love him anyway. But love doesn't always mean good judgment when money's on the table. I want your work to have your name on it, in writing, before there's ever a reason for anyone to argue about whose it was." I didn't fully understand why she felt the urgency of it then. I do now. I went to see the attorney, a careful woman named Renata Fine, 3 weeks later. Over the course of that spring, we filed for a formal trademark on the name Callaway's Smoked Duck Gumbo as a distinct menu item and recipe brand separate from the restaurant's general name. And this part mattered more than I understood at the time. A documented recipe copyright registration for 4 of my original dish formulations, filed under my name, Josephine Callaway, as the sole creator, with development notes, dated kitchen journals, and witness statements from 2 longtime kitchen staff who'd watched me build each recipe from scratch. Odette signed a short letter, notarized the same week, stating clearly that these recipes were my own culinary creation, developed independently of her original menu, and that she claimed no ownership over them. It cost about $2,200 in filing and attorney fees, most of which Odette insisted on covering herself. I filed the paperwork away in a drawer at my apartment and didn't think about it again for almost 4 years. It felt at the time like an unusually thoughtful gift from a grandmother who'd always been more practical than sentimental. I had no idea it would end up being the only thing standing between me and watching a stranger walk into my grandmother's restaurant and put his name on everything I'd built inside it. Odette passed away 14 months ago, peacefully, in her sleep, at 78. The restaurant kept running under Desmond's management, with me still in the kitchen exactly as before, and for a while, nothing about the day-to-day changed enough to worry me. It wasn't until 5 months ago, when Desmond first mentioned, almost casually over a Sunday delivery of crawfish, that he'd been getting some interest in the property from developers looking to build a boutique hotel on that stretch of Perkins Road, that I understood something had already started moving without me. I asked Desmond directly that Sunday whether he was actually considering selling. He waved it off with the same tone he'd used my whole life whenever I asked him something he didn't want to fully answer. "Just talking numbers, Joe. Nothing's decided. You know how these developers are, always sniffing around." I let it go, mostly because I wanted to believe him, and because the restaurant was, in every practical sense, still mine to run in the kitchen every single day. We had a full house most Fridays. The smoked duck gumbo was still our top seller. I was training a new line cook, a 19-year-old named Antoine, who reminded me a little of myself at that age, hungry to learn, showing up early without being asked. Nothing about the daily rhythm of the place felt like it was ending. What I didn't know was that Desmond had already met with Trent Boudreau twice by that point, and that the just talking numbers conversation had, in reality, moved well past talking. 4 months ago, Desmond had my cousin Renee, his daughter, 28, who'd never worked a single shift at the restaurant in her life, but had recently finished a real estate license course, start quietly compiling a valuation packet for the property, including projected revenue figures for a boutique hotel concept, comparable sale prices for 2 other properties on Perkins Road that had recently been redeveloped, and a line item, I found out much later, that specifically valued existing menu IP and signature recipes as part of the restaurant's goodwill at an estimated $85,000, folded into the overall $410,000 asking price. I found out about the valuation packet by accident, the way most of this story unfolded. Not through anyone telling me directly, but through Antoine, my line cook, who mentioned one slow Tuesday afternoon that Renee had stopped by the kitchen the week before, while I was off, taking photos of the walk-in cooler and the smoker out back for some paperwork, and had specifically asked him which dishes on the menu were the most popular, the ones that really make money. Antoine, not knowing any better, told her the truth. The smoked duck gumbo, hands down, followed by the praline bread pudding. I called Desmond that evening. I asked him plainly whether the restaurant was being appraised for sale, and whether my recipes were part of whatever number they were putting on it. He hesitated in a way that told me everything before he even answered. It's just due diligence, Joe. Standard stuff for any sale. Your recipes are part of the menu, sure. They're part of what makes the place valuable. That's not a bad thing. I said, Desmond, are you selling the restaurant? There was a pause long enough that I could hear the television on in the background of wherever he was sitting. We're in talks. Nothing's final. I was going to tell you once terms were closer to settled. I didn't yell at him. I want to be honest about that because I think if I had, this story would have gone very differently, and probably worse for both of us. I told him I needed him to keep me informed going forward, and he said he would. I don't think either of us at that point fully understood how far apart our two ideas of keeping me informed actually were. 3 weeks later, I learned the terms had, in fact, mostly settled, not from Desmond, but from a supplier, a shrimp distributor named Pauline Guidry, who'd worked with the restaurant for over a decade, and who casually mentioned, while dropping off a delivery, that she'd heard from another restaurant owner on Perkins Road that Callaway's kitchen was going to be a hotel lobby by fall. I stood in the walk-in cooler for a full minute after she left, boxes of shrimp still in my arms, trying to figure out how a supplier had heard about this before I had. That was when I went back to the drawer at my apartment and pulled out the folder from Renata Fine's office, the trademark filing, the recipe copyright registrations, Odette's notarized letter, and read through all of it again for the first time in nearly 4 years. I want to be honest about what I felt reading it. It wasn't triumph. It was something closer to grief, mixed with a strange, steadying kind of clarity, the recognition that my grandmother had seen this exact possibility coming years before any of the rest of us had a name for it. I called Renata's office the next morning. She remembered the filing immediately, pulled the file while I was still on the phone, and confirmed what I already suspected but needed to hear from someone whose job it was to know for certain. The trademark on Callaway's smoked duck gumbo and the copyright registrations on my 4 original recipes were valid, current, and registered solely under my name. Any sale of the restaurant that included those recipes, their names, or their use in marketing materials, the valuation packet, the boutique hotel's planned farewell menu concept Desmond had apparently agreed to let the new owners run for 6 months post-sale, would require my explicit licensing agreement or outright assignment of those rights. Without it, Renata said, the buyer would be purchasing a building and a name, but legally not the thing that's actually making the building worth what they think it's worth. I asked her what happens if nobody realizes that until after the papers are signed. Then, she said, it becomes a very expensive problem for everyone involved, usually right around the time the new owner tries to put Callaway's smoked duck gumbo on their opening menu and gets a cease and desist letter instead. I didn't tell Desmond what I knew. Not yet. Some part of me, the same part that had sat quietly through years of being just kitchen staff, in conversations I wasn't invited to, wanted to see exactly how far this would go before anyone thought to ask me a single question about the thing they were actually selling. 6 weeks ago, the same afternoon I opened this story with, Desmond called me into the back office at 4:30, saying only that Trent Boudreau wanted to walk through final paperwork before the closing date. I already knew, by then, exactly what that paperwork would say. I'd spent the 11 days before that meeting having Renata prepare a formal notice, a clear, documented assertion of my ownership over the trademark and copyrighted recipes, along with a licensing proposal outlining the only terms under which I'd allow their continued use by any future owner of the property. I walked into that office at 4:45, 2 minutes before Desmond and Trent, and set my bag down without saying much. My cousin Renee was there too, sitting off to the side with a laptop open, presumably to handle whatever paperwork came next. Desmond had his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, the purchase agreement spread across the desk, a pen already uncapped. "We're just finalizing today, Joe," Desmond said, glancing at me the way you'd glance at someone you expected to simply be in the room, not part of the conversation. "Trent's got the final numbers, and once Renee gets the signature page ready, we should be done within the hour." Trent, a polished man in his 40s with a folder of his own, nodded at me politely, the kind of polite that assumes you're furniture. "Nice to meet you, Joe. Desmond tells me you run the kitchen." "I do," I said. "I also own the recipes you're planning to keep on the menu after this sale closes." The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when nobody's sure yet whether they've misheard something. Desmond let out a short laugh, more nervous than amused. "Joe, come on, not now." I opened the folder I'd brought and set it on top of the purchase agreement, exactly the way I described at the start of this story. Inside were 3 things: the trademark registration certificate for Callaway's smoked duck gumbo, the copyright registration documents for my 4 original recipes, filed under my name alone, and Renata Fine's notice letter, dated the day before, addressed to Desmond, Trent Boudreau, and the title company handling the sale, stating clearly that any transaction including the use, marketing, or continued sale of those specific recipes required my written authorization, which had not been sought or granted. Trent picked up the papers first, reading faster than Desmond, his polite expression sliding into something more careful. "Desmond," he said slowly, "did you know about this?" "That was Joe's grandmother's whole menu," Desmond said, a little too fast. "Those recipes belong to the restaurant. They've always been part of the restaurant." "Not according to this," Trent said, tapping the registration certificate. "This says Josephine Callaway, individually, as sole creator, 4 years ago, with a supporting letter from Odette Callaway explicitly disclaiming ownership. Desmond, our valuation packet has $85,000 of goodwill, built specifically around these recipe names. If she owns them and hasn't licensed them to us, we're not buying what we think we're buying." Desmond looked at me the way I'd imagined he might. In the version of this conversation I'd rehearsed alone in my car more times than I want to admit. Not angry exactly. Caught. "Joe, why would you do this? Why wouldn't you just tell me?" "I did tell you," I said. 3 weeks ago, I asked you directly if I was part of this. You told me it was standard due diligence and that my recipes were just part of the menu. I'm telling you now, formally, that they're not just part of the menu. They're mine, and they have been for 4 years, in writing, with Grandma's own signature confirming it. Nobody in that room raised their voice. I want to be clear about that because I think it mattered. Trent set the papers down and looked at Desmond for a long moment. "We need to pause this," he said. "I'm not closing on a property valuation that's built on IP we don't actually have rights to. You'll need to resolve this with your niece before we can move forward with these terms." I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I picked my folder back up, left the originals with Trent's assistant for the file, and told Desmond I was happy to discuss a fair licensing arrangement whenever he was ready to have that conversation as an actual negotiation, and not as an afterthought he'd forgotten to include me in. I made one phone call after I left that office, to Renata, letting her know the notice had done exactly what she'd said it would. The sale, as originally structured, was dead. Whatever came next would have to include me from the start, not as kitchen staff, but as the person legally holding the one thing that had apparently made the whole deal worth $85,000 more than an empty building. It took 19 days for Desmond to call me back with something resembling an actual proposal. I spent most of those 19 days exactly where I'd always been, in the kitchen, running Friday service, training Antoine on the smoker, making the same red beans and rice every Monday the way Odette had for 37 years before me. I want to be honest that the waiting wasn't easy. There were nights I wondered if I'd blown up something that couldn't be rebuilt, whether protecting what was mine had cost me the only family business I'd ever known. When Desmond finally called, his tone was different than it had been in that office, quieter, more careful, the tone of someone who'd had almost 3 weeks to sit with a version of events he hadn't planned for. "I talked to Trent again," he said, "and I talked to a lawyer of my own finally, which I probably should have done a long time ago. He explained some things to me about how this should have gone from the beginning." I asked him what that meant practically. "It means," he said, "if we want this sale to happen the way Trent needs it to, you need to be part of the negotiation, not an afterthought. Renata's already talked to my attorney about licensing terms. I wanted to call you myself first, before the lawyers finished making it official." I appreciated that he called, even 4 weeks later than it should have happened. We spent the next several days, through our respective attorneys, working out an actual agreement, a licensing arrangement that allowed the new owners to use my recipe names and formulations for a negotiated fee structure, 5% of related menu item revenue for 3 years, along with a one-time buyout option if they preferred a clean break, which Trent's group ultimately chose, at $47,500, once their own accountant ran the numbers on what the multi-year royalty would likely cost them, given the dish's sales history. The sale closed 6 days ago at $427,500 total. The original $410,000 plus the recipe buyout, instead of the $410,000 Desmond had originally tried to close at without me. I didn't ask for revenge in any of those negotiations. I asked for what Renata called fair recognition of documented ownership, and that's what I got, in writing, with my name on every page of the licensing agreement, the way my name should have been on the original sale conversation from the very beginning. About 10 days after the sale closed, my cousin Renee called me, and I want to describe this carefully because I think it matters exactly how it happened. She didn't call to ask how I was doing, or to acknowledge that she'd spent months building a valuation packet around recipes she'd never once asked me about. She called because the delay in closing had pushed back a commission payment she was expecting from the deal, tied to a referral fee for bringing Trent's group to the table in the first place, and she wanted to know if I could speed things along on my end so the final paperwork could clear faster. She never asked about the restaurant, or about missing Grandma, or about what those 4 years of quietly protecting my own recipes had actually cost me in trust with the family. She asked about her commission. I told her the paperwork would move at whatever pace the attorneys needed it to, and left it there. 6 weeks have passed since that afternoon in the back office. The restaurant closed for good 3 days ago, not because the sale fell apart, but because that had always been the plan, boutique hotel included, and Perkins Road will have a new building on that lot within the year. I went in on the last night, unofficially, and cooked the smoked duck gumbo one final time for the staff, Antoine included, in the kitchen where I learned almost everything I know from a woman who saw this exact ending coming years before any of the rest of us wanted to believe it was possible. Desmond and I talk now, more than we did before all this started, strangely enough. It's not the same as it was. There's a formality to it now that wasn't there when I was simply kitchen staff, and he assumed that meant invisible. But it's honest in a way our relationship hadn't been in years. He told me, a few days ago, that he's opening a smaller consulting business helping other family restaurants handle ownership transitions. The right way this time, which I think is his own quiet way of trying to make something useful out of what almost went very wrong between us. I think about Desmond sometimes, and I don't feel hatred toward him. I think he spent so many years being the one who handled the business side, the contracts, the numbers, that he genuinely stopped seeing the kitchen as anything other than an operational detail, even when that operational detail was the only reason customers kept coming back for 30 years. I don't think he meant to erase me. I think he simply never stopped to ask whose hands had actually been building the thing he was trying to sell. If you're watching this and some part of your family has decided your work is just part of the business, instead of something that belongs to you, I want you to hear this clearly. Protecting what you've built isn't disloyalty, even when people around you try to make it feel that way. Sometimes, the quietest form of self-respect is a piece of paper, filed years before anyone thought to ask who it protected, waiting patiently for the one moment it would actually matter. What would you have done sitting in that office, watching someone sell what you built without asking you first? Tell me in the comments. If you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. New stories go up every week here on The Quiet Reckoning. There's another one waiting for you, about a man who spent a decade being told his half of the family land was basically worthless, right up until someone finally checked what was actually zoned underneath it.